This hot sunny setting is relevant to this video, but first let us go back to the blizzard of 1818 in New York City. Imagine there is thick snow everywhere, making moving or carrying anything through the city a slow, monotonous and draining process. And yet there is a fire, and there is one firehouse that is on its way to solve the problem. However, this is under the setting of the cholera outbreak. Most of the firemen are sick, they have fevers, they can barely get out of bed. And so their nurse is setting off to help the team put out the fire. He's dragging this enormous, super heavy cannon of water power through the city. It weighs over a ton, and she has a drag rope slung over her shoulder as she pulls through thick snow that makes every step an insecure and staggering process. She's pulling and pulling the pump engine to the fire through the thick, heavy, blizzardous weather that is pounding at her face, making her skin raw and her vision very, very blurry. And yet she is doing this as a volunteer. This is not her job. This isn't even the paid work of the people that she was nursing. The entire team of firefighters is doing this work voluntarily. And she isn't even one of the official volunteers. She's just there as the assistant to the firehouse owner and as the nurse to the firefighters. And yet she's responded to the call of duty. Her name is Molly Williams. Molly Williams was a slave of Benjamin Aymar in New York City in the early 1800s. Now, Benjamin Aymar had a very opulent house on 42 Greenwich Street, and he had 8 children that Molly was looking after. However, he'd had 9, but one of their children, Mary, had passed away under the age of 1. So here's a beautiful family house on Greenwich Street, and his wife, Elizabeth Van Buren, had managed to birth 9 children but lost 1. And the children's names were Elvira, Edmund, Maria, John, Augustus, Mary Emily, Mary Donaldson, the one who died under the age of 1, Benjamin Nibs Aymar, I don't know where Nibs came from, but that's adorable, and Eliza Dixon Aymar Sands. So Molly was doing the cooking and cleaning and looking after the children in this very nice opulent house in Greenwich Street, and she was very close with the family. But Benjamin was both a very successful merchant, and he was also looking after his assets by creating a firehouse. See, the thing was, New York at the time was very vulnerable to fires, and all over the city were the scars of previous fires. He was a merchant and a very successful one, so he wanted to protect his assets by making a firehouse. So there was a double purpose to him having a firehouse, but he owned this firehouse and he sort of managed this firehouse. He didn't take a salary for doing so. He also was a volunteer there, but he was doing it partly to support his locality, but partly to look after his own interests. However, the entire firefighting team were volunteers. They weren't paid to be there. They were doing it out of the generosity of their hearts. They would get free food and they would get a bit of healthcare as well by being there if they needed a bit of nursing. And during the cholera outbreak, they actually stayed in the firehouse. They were given beds there and Molly would nurse them. She was so busy rushing back and forth looking after all these firefighters who'd come down with cholera. And yet, in the middle of running back and forth between beds of men with fevers who need food and cooling down and more water, she was then suddenly responding to the fire alarm going off, a literal fire alarm. And there weren't enough men, so she joined in. Now, the interesting thing about this particular situation is Charles Dickens was actually in New York at the time, and he reports seeing a merry firefighting team singing on the way to fighting a fire, and with them was one black man who was wearing a red muffler made out of wool, who was happily going along with them and singing along with them and seemingly there to support. Maybe that was Molly. Maybe Dickens had just assumed that it was a man and actually it was Molly. But We do have reports that she was in a calico dress and her checkered apron at the time that she responded to the call. So maybe she put on a fire jacket over the top. And it does seem quite necessary to fighting a fire that you are wearing a fire jacket. So perhaps she was in her calico dress with her checkered apron on, and then she chucked a fire jacket over the top and maybe a red woolen muffler as well around her neck. Maybe that's what happened. So perhaps Charles Dickens actually saw Molly on the way to fight some fires, which is pretty cool. But Molly became the 11th volunteer. So this firehouse was the Oceanus Energy Company in Lower Manhattan, and they had a team of 11 volunteers, with her being the 11th. And what was said of her is that she was as good a fire laddie as many of the boys. However, I find this slightly downplaying, considering the fact when this happened, she was 71 years old. She was dragging an enormous water cannon through the snow-thick streets of New York that even at the time they would have had horse manure and hay and dirt underneath all that snow, making anything they have to drag even worse, because if they do manage to drag it through the snow, they're also dragging it through frozen mud as well and frozen horse poop. So this is a really labor-intensive process, and she's 71 while she's doing this. So saying that she's as good a fire laddie as many of the boys also needs to have the context of the fact that she was getting on in years, and she was showing up to drag this enormous ton after ton. Like, imagine if you're trying to drag an entire car's worth of water behind you through thick snow and frozen mud at the age of 71. Like, I would make more of an impressive statement than she was just as good as many of the boys. No, that's probably more than most boys can do. So it's a sweet statement, but we need a little bit more context to actually understand what she was doing and how impressive it was. What she said is even more modest. I belong to old Levin. I alla runs with that old bulgin. So I think that means I belong to old 11. I always run with that old bull engine. But I think that's very sweet that she's being so modest about the fact that what she's doing is actually really impressive, regardless of her age, really. Like, that's a really, really labor-intensive task to take on and to do at speed. They're trying to respond to this as fast as humanly possible. So the whole process is extremely impressive. So the fact that she's so modest on top of it is amazing. Her husband was also a firefighting volunteer. And what I think is important to understand is the complexity of relationships and the variety of relationships that slaves and slave owners had. Because in this circumstance, Molly Williams was actually made free by her husband. So her freedom was bought from Benjamin by her husband. So she was free, and yet she still returned to work for the family in Greenwich Street, because they were very opulent, and it was a circumstance that she'd lived in, that she felt very familiar with. It was a good circumstance for her, but she needed to have the right to be an employee, make money, but also have employees' rights. So her circumstances improved, but that didn't necessarily mean that her relationship with Benjamin had to be severed, that all ties had to be cut. It was simply that she needed more rights than she had, so she got those rights, and then she could respectfully return to that situation. She continued to work for Benjamin and was an assistant at the firehouse, and that's how she was cooking and cleaning and looking after the equipment, which is no small task. Imagine if all of the clothes are coming back torn, fire damaged, covered in soot. Remember that soot is very sticky. It's not just like, blow some dust off. It's sticky and it's difficult to get rid of. She would then also be covered in it, but they also need massive meals because, you know, they're firefighting and carrying entire human beings or housing beams off people. And it's a very intensive job. Her responsibility as the cook and the cleaner and the equipment maintenance was a very, very big role. She's also having to clean down entire engines when they come back covered in soot and fire damage. She's getting really involved in firefighting, sort of by accident. And she would know a bit about what to do when it comes to fighting a fire. But there's so much to do in the actual fire department, the firehouse, in regards to maintenance, that the blizzard may have been the first time she actually went to a fire in person. I don't think it was. I think there were probably other occasions where she and her husband, and potentially Benjamin as well, were included in being actually at the fire and helping there. But it's reasonable to suggest that this may have been the first time that she actually went and fought a fire in person herself, rather than helping to set up the practical needs of a fire being fought, because there's just so much maintenance that's required for firefighting equipment, as well as firefighting clothing, as well as looking after the actual firefighters. In this situation, she's dealing with a cholera outbreak and has to be a nurse to the entire firefighting team. So there's just so much work that has to be handled behind the scenes before we even get into the fire. But in this circumstance, she's actually managing to drag a carload of water to a fire along with a load of other men, potentially on zero training. I don't necessarily think they were planning on having their cook, cleaner, and nurse actually at the scene of the fire. She may be just walking into the situation without ever having any kind of instruction into how to fight a fire, which again is outstandingly impressive. It wasn't until 35 years later, in 1900, that firefighters actually got any pay at all. This is when professional firefighting started to be a thing, which is kind of insane. Nearly 4 decades later was when they first actually got paid to do a vital job, especially in a built-up city that was covered in scars of previous fires. It's not like they didn't know how dangerous fires were. So let's talk about what it means to be a female firefighter today in the USA. So 55 to 65% of the firefighting force in the US is just volunteers, unpaid people doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And of that percentage, 5% of the paid force of firefighters in the USA are female, and 11% of the volunteers are female. So what does it mean salary-wise if you're getting paid to be a firefighter in the USA as a woman? So the range is quite big, but it comes out at about $59,000 a year as your salary as a paid firefighter in the USA. And in Germany, where I am right now, 95% of the firefighting force is volunteers. Only 5% are being paid. Of that 99%, 10% of the firefighting force is female, which is around 600 firefighters. The kind of middle point salary for a firefighter here, of the 5% who are being paid, is about 57,000 euros a year, which isn't actually that much given how vital their job is. So when it comes to healthcare and pensions and that kind of thing, in the USA you have this thing called length of service awards programs, which is basically how long you've served, but also kind of award points accumulate to a small monthly pension. Not a full one, just a small one. And I don't really know how you win points. Maybe it's like, ooh, that fire was really big, or you did something super brave, and then you kind of accumulate points that way. I don't know how it works, but there's a award system of some kind, as well as it just being how long you've served for. And there's an issue with this, because if you are someone who's a firefighter, you are doing a really dangerous job. I don't know whether anyone's noticed this, because looking at stats about firefighters' pensions and healthcare around the world, it is shocking that most of them are just denied any of that care. But firefighting is really dangerous. And it's quite likely that while someone is in the line of duty, they are going to get either a disabling injury or have something like breathing in too much smoke that means they can't work in that line of duty anymore. So someone who has a pension that's only small, but is in a line of work that is highly likely to put them out of work, as in put them in the way of getting disabled beyond the point of being able to do that line of work, means that they are quite likely to end up not being able to earn money by doing a very vital job. These are the people who need pensions more than anyone else, because they are likely to have to retire earlier than the rest of us. I think they should just be given a pension for the fact that they are willing to be on call, whether they were in active duty or not. The bravery to say, yes, I will be responsible for handling a fire, is worthy of a pension. But most countries don't seem to recognize this. Unfortunately, in Germany, they don't get any pension at all. Neither do they get healthcare. They can get an on-duty protection. So if they're injured on duty, they can have care related to the work injury, which is the same in the States. In the States, they get protection whilst they are in the fire or on the way to the fire. But once they're off duty, anything that happens is their responsibility to pay for, and they have to pay for their own personal healthcare.
which I don't really like, to be honest. However, I would rather that firefighters got full coverage for healthcare, regardless of whether the accident, injury, or sickness occurred during the line of duty or not, because I'm not really interested in our firefighting force having to get a second job in order to pay for treatment for something that isn't a specific work-related illness or injury. I'd rather they just got the money so that they could have the treatments so they can return to duty as quickly as possible. That seems like the best thing for our societies. They do get small tax credits both in Germany and the US. However, I think that firefighters should have full healthcare coverage, whether their accidents, injuries, or sicknesses occur on the line of duty or not. Their private accidents, injuries, and healthcare needs are a responsibility of society if we want them to be available to be on duty. So I think they should have full coverage at all times. And I think that they should have a full pension, because that will encourage people to take on the responsibility of fighting fires. Fires are becoming a more and more relevant topic to the entire globe. Humanity needs to be supporting firefighters more and more right now. So I think we should make changes to give them full pensions and full healthcare coverages at all times. Wildfires are a danger to us all and a danger to the air that we all share. Please encourage your governments to support firefighters in their financial, healthcare, and pension needs, as well as supporting your local firefighters through fundraising campaigns or simply donating things that they might need, like food or medical supplies, or maybe just give some love to your local firehouse. Their responsibility is increasing day by day, and we are reliant on them to keep us safe. It's important that we show them respect, appreciation, and care, and that isn't just through politics. Yes, politicians, yes, we do need to put pressure on our politicians to support our fire brigades and support our firefighters' needs. However, we can also show our local firefighters a little bit of love. Ask what they might need at their local firehouse. It might even be as simple as offering massage vouchers to your local firefighting team or bringing over a cake to the firehouse. Whatever it is, we need to support our firefighters.